Hey there, welcome to another episode of Practically Awake. Today we're going to be talking about the shadow and specifically how the shadow will show up in your sexuality. But first, I want to just talk about the concept of the shadow in general because there's a lot of discourse out there around shadow work, and I don't want to say it's more complicated than general stuff you're going to see on TikTok, but I will say that doing shadow work, there's usually layers to it, and you're going to be doing it for essentially the rest of your life. I don't think there is one person on earth that doesn't have a shadow. That would be almost next to impossible with the way that our psyches are built. Now, what is the shadow? It's essentially everything that ends up in our unconscious mind. So basically 95% of what drives our behavior and how we operate in the world is unconscious to us, and only 5% is conscious. And there's a reason for that, a really good reason. And I also just want to say shadow, it sounds kind of like dark or scary, but shadow simply means what is unseen to you. That's all it means. There's great stuff in the shadow. There might be darker or primal or taboo things in the shadow, but for the most part, it just means unseen. There's really great qualities and parts of your true self that end up in your unconscious mind. Okay, so let's get started on why things end up in your unconscious mind. First, just think of like your general reactions to things. We have reflexes that go into our unconscious mind so that we know if there's an oncoming bus coming towards us, we know how to just jump out of the way. So we're not consciously thinking like, okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to make sure that this bus doesn't hit me? We don't have time for all that, right? So that's why our unconscious logs things back there, because for automatic processes, it is great. Now, sometimes if there are emotions that are too difficult to process, that also goes unconscious to us. So think a beach ball that gets pushed down the surface in water only to come up at a later time when those emotions can be safely expressed. And I know for someone as myself with complex or developmental trauma, sometimes these emotions come up much later in life, and it is something that we need to process to be able to get through to our next level of self-development, healing, or who we want to be. Another reason why things end up in the shadow, and this is the big one and where a lot of the shadow work stuff happens, is because there were certain qualities about us that were deemed uncool or unsafe or not acceptable to be either by our immediate family structures or societal structures as a whole. So as we grow up, especially, we're getting information all the time from the world about what's okay to be and what's not okay to be. And since we're tribal animals, we're always going to want to make sure that we are responding to our environments appropriately so that we can have safety, connection, supports, food, especially when we're very little and we depend on our parents for support. So this is where a lot of true pieces of your personality, of your spirit, of your true self goes back into your personal unconscious. This is the interesting thing. When things go into your unconscious, especially when you've repressed true pieces of yourself, it's always going to want to show itself in certain ways, but in ways that might be safer for us to see. So it's not so direct and jarring. So a lot of times, a lot of pieces of your unconscious content will come up through things like dreams and symbolism. And in Jungian psychology, we also look at our everyday lives as sometimes a waking dream that's also rich in symbolism. And I'll give you an example. Let's say you've repressed a lot of big emotions for whatever reason. Consciously, you're like, I'm fine. Everything's great. I don't feel bad about anything. I don't have any feelings, right? This can get pushed into your unconscious mind as dreams around drowning. Water is symbolic of emotion in most cases. So maybe you'll have dreams around drowning. Maybe you're stuck alone in a rainstorm. Perhaps you're caught in a flood. So this can also translate to your waking life that like suddenly you're constantly stepping in puddles, or you're starting to have plumbing problems in your house, there's a leak in the pool, the toilet's overflowing. This kind of stuff can also show up symbolically in your waking life as a measure of saying, hey, there's something going on here, something symbolic that's being brought up for you to consider. And if you're an intuitive person, sometimes this will show up in your environment through like synchronicities or numbers. Like for me personally, right before a big change is coming, or I know something needs to change in my life, but I'm not consciously ready to accept that yet, I'll start seeing fives everywhere or repeating fives. Fives is generally the number of change. I might have an unconscious desire that suddenly I want to like cut my hair or change my wardrobe, that there's something that I'm reflecting externally that is reflecting my internal unconscious desire for something to change, or my unconscious knowing that something is about to change. So I think you can have a lot of fun with this in the actual real world on how your unconscious will at times talk to you. And it is a relationship. And that's one thing you should think about when it comes to your unconscious mind and your psyche, that there is a natural intelligence that you have, that this stuff will come up at the right time. And you can communicate with this aspect of yourself just by being open and willing to hear what your unconscious has to say to you. For example, when you start doing shadow work, your dreams normally completely ramp up and they get really symbolic and really cool because your unconscious mind is like, okay, like maybe they're ready for some of this content to be brought up and made conscious, because your psyche does actually have the goal of individuating, which is becoming whole, which is making more of that unconscious content conscious, especially as you grow older, as you age, and you feel safer within yourself. It's safer for some of this content to come up, which is why they say individuation work or shadow work, people usually start it around like 30 or 35. You don't normally see teenagers doing shadow work. And this is the reason why. It's, you have to get to a certain point of your life where you are ready to be like, okay, what's the next version of me? And you can feel safe as an adult to go ahead and start excavating the cavern of what's going on in your unconscious mind. As we get older, of course, we have more maturity, we have more tools, we probably have more community, we probably have more financial resources to enlist people like coaches and therapy and all that good stuff. So this is usually the time that this work comes up. Another sign that something's going on and your unconscious wants to show itself is that you keep having repeated undesirable cycles in your life, usually around your relationships, your friendships, or perhaps your job. I'm going to use this example because it is one that very much was my experience. Before I did this work, I would get into patterns of bad relationships, bad jobs, and not know what the problem was. I always, of course, had an excuse on why it didn't work out. It was that person's problem. It was that toxic boss. But when I really started to do this work and realized when a cycle repeats itself, the common denominator is you, and there is something that you are unconsciously attracting or driving certain things in your life because the unconscious mind is at play. So I had an unconscious belief that I was unworthy. I was not worthy of love, of success. I had lots of complexes when it came to this. So therefore, I always ended up in relationships. Like, they all looked different on the surface, and why they didn't work out all looked completely different. So I think for a long time, I was like, they all didn't work out for different reasons, but they all did one thing, which was reconfirm my self-worth issues. Same thing with my jobs, with my corporate jobs. I was kind of a corporate pick-me. I wanted to work really hard. I wanted to always prove my value. I had lots of imposter syndrome. I would consistently get in these jobs where either the boss was toxic, someone would take advantage of me. It would end in this spectacular way. I would be burnt out. And this was the cycle that kept repeating, was that I was burning out over and over and over again. And it was because ding, 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 self-worth, but also to prove myself, I felt like I had to mask a lot. So I was also faking my personality half of the time, which did a number on me. Anyways, I spent like 15 years of therapy trying to break down some of these issues. And only once I started doing shadow work did some of these things come to light for me, and I was able to change the relationship I had with myself, therefore change the relationship I had with other people. And you can do this too if you are in a pattern, an undesired pattern of relationships not working, jobs not working, friendships that drain you or aren't working. There is something unconscious at play, and you can bring it to the surface and move forward to have healthier, more fulfilling relationships. Another way that your unconscious shadow will show itself is through projection, okay? Projection is, let's say you look at somebody and you go, ugh, I can't stand them. They're such a show off. Ugh, okay? You have an emotional attachment to it. It's not like, this person is kind of a show off or whatever, but you don't really attach any emotion to it. It's just kind of like, whatever. I'm talking about when something really bothers you about someone. This means that there is shadow at play. So for the example I just gave, I can't stand that person's a show off. Perhaps maybe in your community, maybe in your family, humility and perhaps essentially being humble was rewarded, and this was something that you thought was like a positive quality, then yeah, you see people that are showing off and you get really upset about it, or you get really emotional, or you get really judgmental. But when a shadow is at play, you have to realize that it is affecting your life in some way. For example, someone that fears coming across as a show off will maybe not show up confidently in certain parts of their life that they need to. So this is why, again, the shadow work on projections is one of the easiest, best, quickest way to get to your shadow. But it does take some work to recognize it and then kind of continue to see it as it comes up so that you can integrate this and it won't have so much of an emotional hold on you moving forward, and you can show up in your life differently. I'll use my own examples in here because I think it's also helpful because I can speak from my own experience. But my big one that I had was manipulative people. I couldn't stand people that were manipulative, Machiavellian, these people that would scam people. And I had this unconscious shadow of like, that wasn't me, because I had some guilt and shame around a time when I was like 19 years old. I worked for this like multi-level marketing company and I totally scammed people. I was like not a good person at this time in my life, but I didn't want to acknowledge that. So instead, I projected it on everybody that walked past me that was, that I deemed to be manipulative. The thing is, almost all projections are rooted in some truth too. Like you can't really project on someone unless that quality is perhaps there. So it's not that I was wrong about certain people that I was pointing out being manipulative, but it was the gusto in the ugh, the ick, the hate, the disgust that I had towards these people was a sign that the shadow was lingering. Again, I denied this part of myself that existed in the past. Maybe I didn't want to admit that I had the capacity for manipulation, or that perhaps I was good at manipulation, because honestly, I was. And by doing this, I was snuffing out my natural charisma and ability to like influence and teach and all of these really awesome qualities about myself, because I was too afraid of coming across manipulative. So this is another way that you could say, wow, me hanging on to that for so long really hurt my self-development on being able to start a business, being able to collect money, these types of things, because I had this fear of being manipulative. Now, let's talk about the way that this shows up in your sex life, because this is something that I'm talking more about and that there isn't a lot out there on. But for my own experience in my own sex life, as well as my life as a dominatrix, and merging this with shadow work and Jungian psychology, I see so clearly how your shadow shows up in your sexuality. This can show up especially if you have sexual desires, you just like don't know where they're coming from, especially if they feel compulsive or like you're not in control, or you feel shame around these desires. That is usually a sign that you have a shadow at play coming through your sexual expression. I'll give a general example, and then I'll be vulnerable here and give one of mine. Okay. So let's say in your life, you might feel like you lack control in certain areas of your life. Things aren't going your way. You feel like you can't ever hurt people's feelings. You're always people pleasing and trying to make sure that nobody dislikes you. So in bed, maybe you want to be a little bit more sadistic. Maybe you want to tie someone up. Maybe you want to verbally humiliate them, and that seems really hot to you. But you're troubled about it because you're like, oh God, I don't want to be one of those people. Like, what's wrong with me that I would like something like that? And you're confused. That's how a shadow can play unconsciously into your sex life. Now, if you could bring the shadow unconscious to conscious, you might be like, ugh, I'm feeling a little out of control right now. I want to, be more in charge in the bedroom and be a little bit more dom. Then you can go have conversations with prospective partners or your current partner to be like, hey, I want to do some of this. I think it would be fun if you think it would be fun, and make sure like you're gaining enthusiastic consent, right? Especially if you're going to be doing anything with like dominance or submission or anything that could be like triggering or traumatic for people, which for some people, yeah, having their partner be aggressive can be not chill or fun for them. So obviously you want to make sure that you're gaining consent. However, if this is unconscious, this could lead to like compulsively watching like BDSM porn or something and then feeling weird or bad about it. It could lead to like, unfortunately, maybe even abusing other people. Like you think, oh, you're having wishful thinking that maybe they're going to be into it if you choke them or something, and then they're not. So this is why you want to bring your kinks or your desires or your fantasies conscious, so that you can play with them ethically and shame-free, because that's the key part, shame-free. And I'm going to be doing a whole course on this, but there are many different routes to why you might have a sexual desire. It could be, there's a repressed fear. It could be there's like a repressed desire. It could be symbolic. It could be from trauma, unfortunately, but it does happen. And I want to also cover that because it can get really complex. If you have a desire that is rooted in something traumatic, it can add a whole new level of shame. But if that's you, I want to tell you, don't feel shame around that. It is just the way that your nervous system and psyche wants to replay something. And it's totally okay to do it if it's not causing you any psychological harm and you're doing it with safe partners. Another one can be just because it's taboo. There's a lot of social taboos out there generally that people like to play out in the bedroom because it's taboo and because it's kind of fun. Or there could be something that was more taboo in your particular family or culture, or certain ways you were shamed when you were younger that might come up in your sexual shadow and want to be expressed. And all reasons are totally fine. And I think that there's been an undue amount of like judgment and shame and kink shaming and all this stuff on people. But I want to confidently tell you, it's okay. Okay. It's all right. As long as you're, trying to be conscious about it, you're trying to engage partners willingly, and you're not feeling shame around it. Like you can just enjoy these things as they come up. And sometimes it doesn't have to be something deep either. You can just like something because you like it, especially certain things that have to do with like impact play or like anything that's like sensory. Sometimes it's just a body thing that, releasing endorphins or pleasurable sensations on the body. It's not necessarily that there's some like deeper unconscious shadow at play on why you like a particular thing. However, the key is if you are feeling some kind of weirdness, shame, you're like really unsure as to why you like something, you feel like it means something, you have an inkling that there's something below the surface, then you're probably right. And it's a time that you can do shadow work on yourself or with a coach like myself, and we would get to the bottom of it. Because I personally think that once you kind of know the root of where things come from, you're more likely to be able to then have a different relationship with that kink, be more empowered, and have more fun. I'm going to give you a couple examples for me. Okay, one, I wanted to be more dominant in the bedroom. This is when I picked up my dominatrix work. And I did all of this when I was in a time where I had no control over my life. I was spiraling. I was drinking a lot. I was like, I don't know what I want. I feel out of control. I gotten laid off from my job. Like there was a lot going on, and going into dominatrix work really helped me regain a sense of control, a sense of confidence. That was honestly very healing for me. Absolutely. And I trust that my unconscious mind was working through me by pushing me to want to be in these more dominant roles sexually, because it did inherently heal a lot with me, not only the relationship to myself, but the relationship to my feminine energy, the relationship to the masculine. So there were secondary benefits of going down the road that I went down. And of course, at the time, I wasn't really sure why I was doing it. There was a lot going on there that I think I can look back now and see that it was all for the right reason and it was all for the right purpose. But there were points in time on my journey being a pro dominatrix and doing online sex work that I struggled. And basically, I wish I could have gone back and coached myself on what I was feeling and what I was processing at the time. Another one that I'm going to give you is, so I had this thing for a while where I was really into porn that had to do with the shoplift. It was like a girl and she's shoplifting, and then like the loss prevention officer is like, oh, you can, either go to jail or like suck my dick. And for whatever reason, I was like really into this porn for a period of time, and I felt so much shame around it because I don't know. I was just like, what's wrong with me? This is like so sick and weird. And most of the girls on there were like a little bit, they're like younger, like, teens, early 20s. So I felt like horrible about that. And then I recognized like later when I was doing my sexual shadow work, I was arrested when I was in my early teens for shoplifting, and the loss prevention officer, while it wasn't the same scenario, it was scary as fuck because he was saying things like about my chest, like me and my friend were there, we stole a bra, so he's asking about our bra sizes. So it was this kind of like sexually charged yet very scary scenario where I didn't feel like I was in control, and perhaps in hindsight maybe a little traumatic. And my sexual psyche was playing this out through this porn I was consuming for a period of time. Once I really brought that conscious of what that was, it was less interesting to me, I guess. So that's another thing too, is that when you bring the unconscious conscious, there are certain things that you thought were like, really hot or it was like really kinky or whatever. And then after you figure out what was driving it, you're like, oh, and then it kind of has less of a hold on you, and you are less likely to be interested in that particular fantasy. Sometimes not. Other times you just bring it conscious. You're like, oh, okay, that's where it came from. Cool. Like, so now I don't have to feel weird or shameful. Like, it's just my psyche, and it's just my psyche's way of processing something that was kind of like scary, but maybe hot, and that you're still trying to process it, basically. Like, go for it. Because this is another thing too, and I could probably do a whole other episode on just like healing from sexual trauma. But when you go through something kind of traumatic, if you've ever read the book, The Body Keeps Score, essentially you basically have this stressful event, and unless you can like get it out of your body, it kind of just stays there, and your nervous system wants to replay this unfavorable event over again so that you can get out of it safe and sound, so that you can do the final, oh, okay, I'm okay, the parasympathetic like chill, I've released this. And so a lot of times when you're processing something and your nervous system doesn't feel like you got out of that situation totally safe, you might be more likely to even put yourself in that situation again. And this is kind of where you see that people will replay out their traumas sometimes, or perhaps they might develop a fantasy or a fetish around it. It's really because your nervous system is going, what happened there? Like, how do we do that again and actually be safe and get out of it safe? Which is why it's important that if you have gone through sexual trauma and you find yourself getting in situations where you're getting re-traumatized, or you're being attracted to situations where it's happening over and over again, definitely seek therapy for this. Go to see a licensed therapist, but also understand that it is strangely a natural function. And if you can bring that conscious, then you could actually play it out in the bedroom with a safe and consenting partner, right? Versus going down the road where something perhaps unsafe happens that can traumatize you further. I'm going to do a whole episode on basically just on my own experience on healing after a sexual traumatic event. But just to give a little overview, that's what generally happens, is that people will kind of go to reprocess this trauma. either in a safe way, like with a consenting partner, or in an unsafe way where they're continuously getting re-victimized. There's also a lot of parallels with things that go on in your everyday life into your sexual life. For example, if you don't feel like you can speak up in front of your boss, you might have an issue speaking up in front of your partner when you're in the bedroom. So there's a lot of things that working on your sexual psyche, what it actually does for your life in general, and how it ripples out and it translates to all things. And from a spiritual aspect, your sex chakra is your sacral, which is also around like money and creation and all of this stuff. So generally you see once you work on that piece, it will start rippling out to other things in your life, like financial abundance, creativity, all of that good stuff.